Hello, podcast listeners. It's Crispina here. Welcome to this special episode of Work It. We are embarking on a limited series and we are calling it The Leader's Chair.
Hello everyone, Adrian here. You know how when you see movie directors in action, they always have a chair with their title on it? That's the inspiration behind this.
Plus, the idea that the top seat in the house can sometimes get very hot. To kick off this series, we have in the studio with us Mr. Ben King. Ben is Country Director for Google Singapore, right?
That is correct.
And before joining Google in 2012, Ben worked at Microsoft Advertising in Australia, where he comes from. Welcome to Work It, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, Ben, tell me as a start, when people meet you for the first time and you tell them you work for Google, what's the reaction that you normally get?
The reaction that I got when I first started at Google is probably a little bit different to now. I think when we first started, I'm 11 years in at Google now, so a bit over a decade. It was, wow, that's exciting. Tell me more. It was a bit of a black box about what happened inside the four walls. Do you have massages? Do you get free food? All these sorts of things.
Do you?
Of course. But the company's much more than that as well.
Yeah.
As we've gone along, obviously, the world's changed. Technology has become front and center in so many industries, in people's lives, so on and so forth. And people have far more prescriptive questions that they ask us now about very specific topics that might be very real for them in their day-to-day lives. It has changed from, as I say, a bit of black box, very, very cool. The term big tech obviously became more prevalent maybe 5 years or so ago. I think that's probably to do with how important technology has become in the lives of people that we engage.
I would say in Singapore, it's very competitive as an economy and people are quite achievement-oriented, and to be a C-suite leader like yourself is a huge bragging rights. So tell us a bit about your own journey. Do you envision being a leader at the start of your career? Did a 25-year-old Ben envision this would happen?
I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunities I've been given at Google, and I don't think that at 25 I would have guessed that I'd be doing the jobs that I've done over the last few years with the company. That said, I've always been fascinated by leadership. I was captaining cricket teams when I was 22, and I was really passionate about the whole prospect of leadership, but really actually more geared around sports leadership. That was where my interest in leadership began. That's where I started to take my first steps towards understanding the different nuances that you could bring to play to bring a group of people together around common goals. I think that I always saw myself as moving into leadership, to answer the question directly, but no, I definitely did not have a clear view on where I'd end up. In fact, going into the tech industry was somewhat by accident. So I studied media and communications at university. I have a major in modern history, a major in ancient history, and a major in media and communications. And I went and played cricket over in England with my then girlfriend, now wife. We travelled for 6 months after that, came back and wanted to start my career. And I actually called up a friend of mine who was in sports marketing. And I said, what should I do? And he said, you should go into new media, which is what then people were calling digital media, which is a bit ironic now. Yeah. And so it was a bit of an accident that I ended up then going into a small ad network. It was a small digital sales business. I then moved to the company that was acquired by Microsoft. And that really kickstarted things for me. So by no means at 25 did I have a clear view of exactly where I wanted to go. There was a bit of luck in that as well.
Please emphasize this for the young Singaporean who has a very set idea of, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this internship and then I'm going to get to Google.
The world's changing so rapidly. I mean, the skills that are going to be required in 10 years, we don't even really know a lot of those skills yet. I mean, when I first came into Google, the mobile evolution was really only then taking hold. And here we are in very much a mobile-first world. So you don't know what sort of problems you're going to be solving for. So you have to have an open view on how you're going to develop your skill sets, and you've got to have that sort of lifelong learning mentality, which you hear the Singaporean government talk a lot about. And I truly believe is the right way to be thinking.
So I'm curious. I manage a very small team, and already some days I need 2 glasses of wine after the day ends. I assume your role, you multiply that on several levels, right? What do you start your day with? Do you have a priority? I'm sure your to-do list is very long.
Well, I think there's the management side of it, which we can definitely talk about. And then there's also how I manage my time. Maybe I'll start on the second, which is how I manage my calendar. We were mentioning just as we were walking in our experiences of COVID.
Oh, yeah.
To take the listeners back into that conversation just quickly, I went from a situation whereby I was traveling every other week, actually something like 100, 140 planes a year, which is probably terrible from a sustainability footprint standpoint, but I had jobs all around the region. And went from a scenario where I had no children to suddenly being locked in my bedroom. 80% of the time I wasn't set up with a home office. I mean, no one really thought about that
Nobody
pre-COVID.
was. Yeah.
And I had 2 young girls, twins, that were about 1 year of age, and they weren't sleeping and all this sort of stuff. So I was going through quite a difficult period when the country started to lock down and trying to manage my workload very much on top of that. It just felt like there was just no separation between anything.
Yep.
And I think the lessons learned through that period actually have fed into how I do manage my time now and far more rigorously thinking about how I separate out time for different things. So a couple of tidbits, if you will.
Sure.
I think, first of all, calendar for me is actually my to-do list. I don't have a to-do list. It all sits in my calendar. And this came from Philip Schindler. He's effectively our chief business officer at Google. And I heard him speak during COVID and it really resonated with me. So if you think about what that means, you have your steady state meetings that are going to happen every week. You have your ad hoc meetings that go around it. But then if you think about, okay, we got a podcast today, that will go in my calendar, but it'll also have some prep time in the lead up that will be built into my calendar. So it doesn't get stacked into the back end of a night. I'll have time set aside for emailing. I'll have time set aside for work. And I'll have time set aside for thinking. Like it really becomes a to-do list and a way of managing my life end to end from a work standpoint. But it also then allows me to calendar for my personal life as well. So I'll calendar for dinner, so I'm really present with my wife during that period, or calendaring for my kids.
Yep.
And it can sometimes feel a little bit too structured. And of course, there's malleability and you have to bend things every now and then. But being able to pass out time to really focus on what you need to focus on so that you don't leave things to chance, you don't push things into the back end of a night are really important for me. The second thing that I learned was that Monday mornings for me are a protected area.
Ooh.
So
Those are the worst times. Monday morning is usually manic for me.
Well, just to share how I think about it, used to be. I used to start at about 8:30 with one-on-ones.
Right.
I don't take a meeting now before 12 o'clock. But it doesn't mean that I'm not working. So
Yes,
I'm
of
working
course.
from 7 to 12, and it allows me time to do all my pre-reads, make sure I'm organised for the week, get ahead of the week, make sure my inbox is well managed. That's one benefit. But the other benefit is that it takes pressure off Sunday. In my house, Sunday is called Daddy Day.
Yeah.
So I spend that time with my
Oh, that's
children,
so nice.
dedicated. And sometimes I need to work in the afternoon, of course. I know that I've got that sort of 5-hour window that I can push things to. So I don't feel that need to be really engaged with work throughout the Sunday. And that's helped my well-being a lot. Like if you think about that separation that we talked about in COVID that I just didn't feel. So that's been hugely beneficial for me. And I think the last thing that I'd share is that I'm time poor like all of us. And
Everyone is.
Yeah, I'm no different to you guys. But then, I'm also a little bit impatient. So with regard to fitness, if I can build it into something functional, it really works for me. So now I've turned my commute into fitness. So I run to work, it's 5.5 kilometres, or I ride home. And that's really helped me use my time well and then also get a bit healthier. So these are some of the things that I've worked on in managing my to-do list, managing my time, and managing towards a better level of effectiveness.
Yeah, it sounds like a very good plan.
Yeah, I think the compartmentalizing of things really make a lot of sense because especially when we work from home, it's very easy to just go head deep into work and neglect the fact that, I'm also a parent and it's good to dedicate all this time
I really
around.
like the thinking time because I find that's usually missing in a busy day, which is back-to-back meetings or somebody's presenting an idea, blah, blah, blah. You find that you didn't have time to take a beat and think about, right?
Yeah.
And that's so central to the so-called head work that you do.
Yeah. As you move on in your career, I think you go from a set of responsibilities which are very execution focused to when you move into leadership, it's actually not about all the things you do. It's about the decisions you make.
Yep.
And it's very hard to make meaningful or thoughtful decisions if you have no time to actually consider them.
Yes.
If you're constantly in execution modes, it's very difficult to take a beat, take a step back. So I think it's actually critical to the success or failure of the role as well. Because I think a lot of people, they develop their career based on really first-class execution and what they deliver. And that's great, right? You have to have that foundation. But making that transition to be able to be, hey, look, I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm definitely not the person who knows the most about this topic. I'm not the person who's maybe delivering all of that executional workload. But I do have a significant value creation to add in the room.
Right.
That's a hard transition to make and something that took me some time. I find lots of people take a bit of time to work through that and realize the differences.
I think one thing when we talk about leadership, we often see the very nice side of things, especially on social media, how they are winging it, how they are on stage, getting all the accolades, the flowers, the praises. But I do think they are really just like everyone else. They also have their setbacks, their disappointment. How do you deal with all that? What are some of the things that you have to go through before you're able to perhaps identify what worked for you?
That's a great question. Maybe I could give you a bit of a view of how I think about it, let's call it philosophically, and then maybe give you an exact example of something that I had to work
Sounds
through.
like a plan.
I used to see things as ups and downs, and I used to ride that a lot more on a personal level, certainly in the early part of my career. And as I've gone along, I've learned to think about it a bit differently. I actually think the hard times and the good times, they're absolutely necessary. They're also inevitable. And they're actually 100% tied if you see it the right way. The benefits in failure and the learning opportunities that you might experience in those environments. And in successes, you talk about getting up on stage and that sort of thing. Actually, it's nothing to do with you at all. It's about how do you shine a light on others and these sorts of things. But coming back to this whole principle of riding through it, I'm a huge Tom Brady fan. I was watching his documentary. It's called Man in the Arena. And the 9th episode's called Maybe. It's about the Chinese farmer.
Okay.
And he starts off the episode by telling the fable. So maybe I can really quickly. But it goes something along the lines of, a Chinese farmer had one horse, the horse ran away, all the villagers came and said, "Oh my goodness, you must be so sad." And he said, "Maybe." And then the horse came back the next day and brought 10 horses with him. And all the villagers came in and said, "Oh my goodness, you must be so happy. What a blessing." And he said, "Maybe." And then they were breaking in the horses and his son fell off the horse and broke his leg. All the villagers came in and said, "Oh, what a tragedy." He said, "Maybe." Then a war breaks out and his son can't go to war because he has a broken leg. You kind of get the picture. The picture being that the ups and downs of life, you don't really 100% know what they will lead to when you think about it on a long-term horizon. Something that, might seem to be incredibly amazing in the moment or incredibly challenging might actually end up being completely the reverse.
Yeah.
So having perspective on a long-term horizon, seeing the learnings in each of the different experiences that you have are very important. So to take you to
Your practical
a
example.
practical example in my
Reminder.
life. Yeah. My first year in Thailand was lucky enough to win the country manager role in Thailand. I was 32 years of age, so pretty untested, maybe a little bit too young to be speaking frankly. I was put into a situation where the business wasn't doing very well. We inherited a business plan. The reality was a bit different. We were operating at about 50, 60% capacity, so we didn't have a full team. We had a pretty upset customer community. So customers hadn't been engaged probably the way they wanted to for maybe 6 months leading in. And there was a range of market challenges as well. The government and Google were working through a few issues. It all culminated in October when the king died, which was a big, big moment in the country. So it was an incredibly tough year. And I was experiencing huge doubts throughout, if I'm speaking frankly. Doubts based on the fact that maybe I hadn't done it before and wasn't tried and tested. I'm not an anxious person. I don't feel anxiety too often, but I did wake up with genuine pain in my chest for like 6 months. That was the way it iterated for me. So it was a tough, tough year. And then you need to kind of like front up and go to work and lead and that sort of thing. So super, super tough year, and one that I look back on and still makes me feel, wow, that was a pretty challenging time.
Yeah.
But then on the reverse of it, if I look back now, the learnings that I gained as a leader, but then also the experiences we went through as a team, it did two things. The experiences as a team, it helped us build a very, very successful business over a number of years. So I was there for 4.5 years. And it was a really wonderful window of time in my career, and we had great success as a team and those sorts of things. But it also helped me build skills that set me up for challenges that were to come. COVID is an example, obviously going through a pretty interesting macroeconomic climate at the moment. So those tools and skills that you build around focusing on fundamentals of a business, build the fundamentals, build it right, building the right culture based on trust and a high performance bar and collaboration, they're super important for me. And the fact that going through very, very challenging times can also offer an opportunity to build a team identity. It can be invincible.
Because everyone is going through the same thing.
Right. And it also helps you juxtapose when the good times come.
Yeah.
You really relate to that
So
journey
you're
you've been on
that
together.
farmer with the maybe.
It really it just resonated with me. I was like, that to me sounds about right.
When you have the success, you're like, okay, that's great. But, I remember that time when I was struggling, right?
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Helps contextualize things, and there's a lot of lessons in it too.
Yeah. Okay. So I was reading this piece in the Harvard Business Review, and I wanted to get your take on it. Okay. It was research done by an executive search firm that focuses on C-suite leaders, right? Social skills came up as one of the things that people are looking for now to lead organizations because it's just so chaotic and things are changing so fast. So they listed it out. They said self-awareness, the ability to listen and communicate well, a facility for working with different types of people, and apparently something called a theory of mind, which is the capacity to infer what others are thinking and feeling. So this is what I want to get your take on. I kind of more or less have concluded that these are hard skills to master.
Right.
What have you learned moving up the career ladder about these skills and how important they are?
They're very difficult skills to learn within one individual. As you were going through them, look, I couldn't agree more. I think there's a role for an organisation, though, to set up a culture whereby these things are really, one, celebrated, but two, they help leaders to evolve them. And maybe I could give that perspective.
Yes.
From a self-awareness standpoint, we talk a lot at Google about the ability to be able to take feedback, to be able to seek feedback, but more importantly, be able to actually act on feedback.
Yes. Yeah.
Many organizations talk about this. We take it very seriously. And as a leadership team or as leaders at Google, some people come to me in a career discussion and I'll say, what do you want to do with your career? And they say, I want to be a manager. And my first question is, why? Why do you want to become a manager? It can be incredibly rewarding, but it's very challenging as well.
Yes.
You want to be very clear about why you want to lead people. It can't just be about linear career progression.
Of course,
It'll become very challenging.
Yeah.
And so going back to why it can be difficult, well, you get feedback from all angles. You're getting constant feedback from your reports through surveys that are set up, getting feedback from an organizational standpoint through our Google Geist and a range of other 360 channels. But it does talk to this need for self-awareness, because I think if you're just constantly getting feedback that surprises you, it's going to be very problematic.
Yes.
So being able to seek feedback in those areas that you can, in a self-aware fashion, identify, I think is super important. So I would agree with that 100%. And certainly from an organizational standpoint, we do as well. The listening point is super interesting. There's various different bits of advice floating around about being the last person to speak in the room and
I
making
don't
sure
know about that. Do you agree with
Sometimes the last person may not have airtime to even speak.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure I exercise the last person to speak thing all the time, but I think there is
I don't.
also...
I'm the first.
Look, I do think there's time for directive leadership when there's challenges that are being faced and that sort of thing. But as a principle, I think making sure everybody's voice is heard is a very, very important principle to anchor around. In fact, the whole idea of inclusion, I mean, we talk about DEI all the time, but inclusion for me, it can be in multiple things. And in its most basic sense, it's making sure that everybody in the room feels like they have a voice and that they can and are empowered to speak. I do believe in that as well, because, you never know where the idea might come that can help solve the biggest
absolutely.
challenge.
Yeah.
And if you're not hearing people, then you're really limiting yourself in terms of the perspectives that you can bring forward. Engaging with different types of people, I think it's the same sort of principle, except it's probably the D side of DEI, ensuring that you've got a really diverse group of people in your team. We're lucky enough to have 20 over nationalities in the team that I run alone. That's the Singapore climate.
Yes,
we have a lot of international presence. We have a lot of local presence as well, of course. But being able to manage all these various different types of people from various different backgrounds, and I'm talking about nationality as one element of diversity. There are many.
There's gender as well, and
sexual orientation, religious backgrounds, all these sorts of things. And people come from different perspectives. And being able to incorporate those perspectives will help you get to better outcomes and get to better decisions. I would agree with the study, but I also see, I guess, artifacts of each within how our organisation thinks. And then to answer the question on myself, well, that's a constant learning process for me.
Okay.
I'm learning on all three of them, constantly getting feedback, and I can see, one or two out of these that I need to work on more than others, right? So as we all have development
but we
areas.
shan't.
But looking at all these skills, it also occurred to me that it seems more prevalent in people who, Crispina, like yourself, you're an extrovert. So communicate, hanging out with people, speaking with them, seems like second nature. Whereas for an introvert like myself, it might be a bit more difficult and I need so much more time to decompress. So on that notion, does it mean for some people, being a leader is somewhat a given, whereas for some other people, it might be a huge struggle?
We used to grapple with this a little bit in terms of executive presence. This need to have executive presence was seen as something that was required in order to move up or go into leadership roles. And over time, that's been unwound.
Oh,
because
that's interesting.
it comes in different ways. It comes in terms of influence, as an example, because presence can lend itself to, I'm good on stage, or I speak really well. Well, the reality is someone may not be the most charismatic speaker, but they could be an incredible thinker and somebody that can influence in ways that other people just cannot. I think there's been a recalibration in our organisation away from that. So when I hear you say social skills, I don't immediately think extrovert, because actually self-awareness, you don't need to be an extrovert to be self-aware.
Absolutely,
To listen, you certainly don't need to be an extrovert to be
In
able to
fact,
be a
to
good
be an
listener.
introvert, you are probably a likely better listener.
Very much so. Being able to engage with different types of people, okay, maybe you could make an argument that would be more of an extroverted attribute. But we have leaders of all variety in our organization. Some that are really charismatic, some that are hypersocial, some that are highly introverted and less charismatic. And in my experience, actually, probably the second side has been the more successful leader in many instances that I can think of. I'm not going to obviously name names.
That's very fascinating.
Yeah.
And very validating also for introverts. Because I get the sense that some people always think, oh, I can't do this, can't deal with people, I can't deal with teams, it's just too much for me. Just let me do my stuff. I'm really good at it. But it's a waste because, they have all these other skills and influence is a very big factor, right?
100%. But then there might be individuals that genuinely do just want to focus on individual contributor.
And that's fine too.
And that's fine. That is fine. Yeah. Look, everybody's career journey is different and there's various different ways to achieve success.
Yeah.
In fact, I think success is a relative term. I think
it is.
Too often people think of success in terms of linear progression or more money.
Yep.
They're definite, markers of success, I guess, for different people. But
to support leaders, when you make the transition, nobody tells you exactly what the job entails. And then you're confronted with it. What kind of support really helped you? Did you had mentors? Did you have good friends that you could speak to and say, hey, I'm having this problem with this guy. How do I solve this?
Yeah.
Should a company really invest in somebody and make him as successful as they can?
There's a responsibility of a company to support people who are going into new and varied scoping, whether that be management or other, the tools that can help them be successful for sure. So I can talk a little bit about how I think about that and what's been helpful for me. But I also do think, going back to this self-awareness piece, I think the most successful people that I have been around have been people who are able to self-diagnose and take time to self-diagnose where they've made mistakes, where they're going wrong, where they're not having as much impact. So I won't talk so much about that, but there is a huge element, I believe, in being able to create time and be harsh enough on yourself, but also complimentary enough on yourself as well when things are going well, to be able to self-diagnose those good and bad. But coming back to it, and the responsibilities of a company, I think any manager that gets a management role at Google gets new manager training, and that can run from how you deal with difficult scenarios, how you deal with performance issues, right the way through to how you navigate our tools. One of the hardest things that I found when I moved into management at Google was navigating tools. It can be incredibly time-consuming. You've got to navigate all these different sort
the
of
performance reviews and stuff, right? Yeah.
So holistic manager training is really important. Now, outside of that, it's an ongoing exercise. Now, as you go up the levels at Google, there's various different training tracks that you'll get on. So when you get made a director, you'll go through a range of different training tracks, which I found to be incredibly useful. So that's sort of like the learning side of it. But then you're also very much encouraged to have time set aside for personal development planning, PDP, which is career, but then also what sort of skill sets do you need to evolve. As part of a PDP, you would then start to assign or be assigned to previously what we called stretch projects, things that are going to really bend you a little bit and help you expand your knowledge base and skill sets. And then 100% having a mentor assigned is encouraged. So a mentor outside of your line management where you can go in and just be truly vulnerable, very
wonderful,
transparent.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there is a bit of a responsibility of a company, but then some of that as well is also self-initiated too. It comes back to the individual owning your career and pulling together these various different tools, making use of them, and then also self-diagnosing and being really autonomous about how you manage your own development.
So taking charge, basically, it's your career after all, right?
Absolutely.
Nonetheless, it's a really great initiative on Google's part. But I think, unfortunately, not many people may have the luxury or opportunity to work for such an enlightened employer. So very much on the individual front, and considering that we are in a different time altogether, what are some of the tips and advice over and above what you've shared that you'd like to give to the young people nowadays who may already have an eye on leadership? And how would you advise them to perhaps take note of certain things and to maybe sidestep some of the mistakes?
No, cannot sidestep mistake.
Must go through it. Must go through.
Yeah. There's a couple of things here. The first principle I'd anchor on is that a career is a journey. It's almost like a marathon. It's important to be resilient, but it's also important to enjoy the journey because sometimes the destination, it's not what you always thought it was going to be. But if you think about what that means, it means you need to continually be evolving and learning. The world that we're living in now, skills required today are going to be different from the skills required in the future. If we look at a study that we actually ran with Economist Impact, 42% of people actually don't go through reskilling or feel they shouldn't because they lack time. About 70% felt digital skills are really important but even more important than things like self-management and entrepreneurial skills. And about half the people surveyed actually didn't understand what was required to lead to employment outcomes, right?
Yeah.
So there is a bit of confusion in the market in Singapore. I guess the headline is that Singaporeans see value in skilling, but they're just not 100% sure about how to fit it in. They're not 100% sure about how it will lead to employment outcomes. So if I think about this whole principle about a career being a journey, look, it's not really a nice to have. It's actually a very important thing that people are thinking about is consistent skill development and consistent areas of learning. There's ways you can do that. There's micro-credentials online. There's a lot of things that are available at people's fingertips that weren't available when I was first starting out in my career. So I think that's number one. I think number two, don't shy away from challenges. I think some people think go to the growth opportunity, go to the thing that's swelling at the time. I actually think about it very differently. I was 2 years into Google when the head of Southeast Asia at the time said, you want a new challenge, right? And, what does that look like? What do you want to do? And I went away for a day or two and I came back and I said, you know what? Just give me the biggest problem you have. I don't care where it is. And that started my journey around the region. He gave me an opportunity in Thailand. I flew out on a Monday, came back on a Friday. That was the first time in Thailand. And that really set me on a path, right? Go tackle the worst problem. Because if you can overcome it, you'll develop skills, you'll develop belief, you'll become versatile. And I think these things matter. And then finally, I think a bit of advice would be think about lateral impact, not just linear or business impact. Ask yourself the question, are people better off for having me around or not? And you're genuine about really trying to be a net positive contributor to people around you, it will orientate your behaviours in ways that you may not even think. You'll really be working to up-level people around you, the whole boats rise with the tide type scenario. You'll make sure that you're shining light on people when success comes, which is hugely important for developing resilience in teams and developing belief amongst people around you. And you become more and more valuable to a company. So thinking more about lateral, or not necessarily more, but equally about lateral impact as it is the business impact around which you're trying to orientate. So there's a couple of tidbits.
With you in Google, I have to ask this about generative AI. Some people are saying that it's the new industrial revolution. It's going to usher in a completely new world. We grapple with it because AI can write stories and maybe the brief. I don't know. For a podcast. What do you see is the biggest challenge in this in terms of even the people learning the skills? You talked about skills, right?
Yeah.
So I know it's coming. I'm sure at some point I'll have to figure it out.
Yeah.
What do you think would be the challenge from where you sit or what you've been watching?
Well, I think there's a couple of challenges. I think one you've indicated in your question, actually, which is people skilling in this area. It's our belief that AI will be supplementary to people's work. It won't be replacing people's work. But ultimately, people who understand AI and how to leverage AI might replace people who do not. That's really the way that we might think about it, right? So skilling around this area and making sure that you're really up to date and that you're continually thinking about how to leverage AI and you understand the principles underlying the evolutions around which we're all operating at the moment, I think will be important. Probably more on a macro level, less about the labour market and more on a macro level. I think one of the big challenges is scaling technology like this very quickly. And we've been very careful around this. We've been very careful to call out Google's going to approach this in a responsible fashion. That we're going to think very carefully about, topics or issues around sort of misinformation. That's a genuine challenge, And I think our company feels very, very strongly about being careful as it relates to how we roll this out. And that's one of the reasons why I love working for Google, is the responsibility and doing it in the right way is something that we care deeply about and we live through our actions as well. So that'd be two challenges, skilling and then how do you scale this in a responsible fashion?
In a responsible way that doesn't hurt, right?
Right.
We're grappling with the same issue as well. The ethical questions around it, the misinformation is huge, right? Because it's so sophisticated, you can't even tell.
And it's a black box. You don't really know what's going on.
Before we go, we want to ask you some fun questions.
Okay, shoot.
We're doing something different for this series. So we'll ask offbeat questions and you answer them based on whatever comes to your mind. Okay, ready? How do you deal with a problem that's hard to solve?
Oof. Try to go back to first principles, break it apart in digestible areas, and tackle one by one.
What do you do to relax?
Sport, fitness, a little bit of golf. Spend time with my kids, not that relaxing, but I enjoy it.
No, that's not relaxing.
Okay, complete the following sentence. A good leader is someone who
leads with empathy and understands their additive value. And that's not always about being the smartest person in the room or the expert on every topic.
That's a good one.
Fantastic. That's a great one. Okay, final one. Of all the bosses you've had, what was the best trait of someone you admired?
Oh, wow. I've had amazing bosses.
It can be a composite of traits.
You know, there's two that come
bosses.
to mind. I'm not going to say who's who, but there was one who was just the most empathetic person I think I've ever been around. Just made everybody feel incredibly engaged and cared for. And then on the other side of it, I'm not saying this person wasn't empathetic, but the biggest thinker I've ever been around. That just challenged you to think way outside the square, to think 10x genuinely, and was relentless in it,
Oh, wow.
which created a super exciting place to work.
Okay.
Amazing. Thanks everyone for listening. We hope you liked our limited series. If you have questions you would like us to ask, please get in touch with us. We are at cnapodcast@mediacorp.com.sg.
The team that makes this possible, Joanne Chan, Jacqueline Chan, Tiffany Ang, Saya Win, and I'm Crispina. See you next week.